Hi, welcome back to Last Records. Today we're looking at some of the most shocking Karen deaths I've ever researched. Cases that make me wonder how far someone can go when they're convinced they're right. From a Karen who live-streamed herself eating a highly toxic fish, to a Karen who took a dangerous shortcut rather than wait her turn and found herself trapped in a way she never expected.
It was September 2017 in Horry County, South Carolina. The evening was warm, clear enough to keep the windows open, and somewhere in a residential kitchen, a phone was propped on a cutting board with a ring light aimed at the counter. A live stream was already running, and the comment section had started filling up almost immediately. And I want you to hold that detail because it becomes important later. Deborah Lynn Coulter was 43, a stay-at-home property owner with no culinary training and no background in food science or toxicology. What she did have was a reputation in her neighborhood for filing complaints, noise violation, exotic animal ordinances, anything she believed warranted official attention. I mention that not to reduce her to it, but because it's part of understanding why a Brave Foods challenge was the kind of thing she wanted to do on camera. She had something to prove about her own nerve, and she'd been promoting the stream for days. The fish she purchased was a fresh puffer fish from a private online seller, with no certification or preparation guidance. The listing described the fish as pre-clean. Based on what investigators found in that kitchen, it wasn't. And here's the thing I kept coming back to. You can find the basic facts about pufferfish toxicity in about 4 minutes online. Tetrodotoxin is concentrated in the liver, the skin, the ovaries, and the intestines. Licensed fugu chefs train for years to remove those organs without contaminating the flesh. That information is not buried. It is not technical. It is the first thing that comes up. I don't know what Deborah read before she bought the fish, but based on what she did next, it wasn't that. She began preparation on camera without removing the internal organs first. Her knife passed through the body cavity. Within the first 20 minutes, she ate a portion of the flesh. Nothing happened immediately, and I think that's one of the cruelest things about tetrodotoxin. It doesn't announce itself right away. It gives you just enough time to feel like you were right. The comment section was already filling with warnings. The messages were not vague. People were being specific, naming the toxin, explaining exactly why what she was doing was dangerous. Deborah read several of them on camera, dismissed them, and began blocking users. That's the detail I keep coming back to. More than the fish, more than the preparation, the blocking. Because those weren't trolls. Those were people who knew something she didn't, trying to reach her in real time, and she treated it like interference. Around the 25-minute mark, the recording shows her describing numbness in her lips, framing it as the fish being intense rather than anything wrong, still performing. And I have to be honest, that part is hard to sit with because you can see exactly where this is going, and she clearly cannot. By the 30-minute mark, her speech had slurred, and she set her fork down. A glass came off the counter around the 35-minute mark. She didn't catch it. By the 45-minute mark, the camera was still running, but Deborah was no longer visible, and there was no more sound. I want to be precise about what tetrodotoxin does because it matters for understanding how narrow the window for survival actually is. TTX blocks the nerve signals that tell your muscles to contract, including the diaphragm, which controls breathing. There is no antidote. The only intervention is ventilatory support started before respiratory failure sets in, and without rapid medical intervention, survival becomes unlikely. Deborah was alone in her kitchen. Nobody in that comment section could do anything except watch. A viewer contacted emergency services after the stream had been silent for several minutes. Responders found Deborah unresponsive, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause was confirmed as tetrodotoxin poisoning leading to respiratory failure. The recording was preserved before the platform removed it. Purchase records from the vendor were recovered. No criminal liability was assigned. The purchase was made willingly from an unregulated source. I've thought about that more than I expected to. Nobody was charged. A vendor with no certification sold a product with no preparation guidelines and walked away clean. That's how the case closed.
It was May 12, 2018, and a shopping plaza in suburban Houston, Texas was operating at typical weekend capacity, with steady vehicle turnover, moderate pedestrian traffic, and full occupancy in the main parking rows. Nothing about the environment suggested anything beyond routine consumer activity. Vonda Strike, 49, lived a few miles from the plaza and worked part-time in administrative support for a local clinic. She had no reported medical conditions that affected mobility and was described by acquaintances as generally assertive in everyday interactions, particularly in public service settings. She was alone that afternoon, driving a mid-size SUV. The parking lot had a standard layout with marked stalls, a central driving lane, and concrete wheel stops separating vehicles from pedestrian walkways. Surveillance footage later showed consistent vehicle flow, with drivers circling for available spaces due to peak demand. A vehicle had just begun reversing out of a parking space near the front row when Vonda entered the lane behind it. At the same time, another driver had been waiting on the opposite side of the aisle, preparing to move into the newly vacated spot. Both vehicles signaled intent to occupy the same space within seconds of each other. Normally, one driver yields or pauses once the other vehicle commits to reversing, preventing anyone from entering the blind zone at the same time. Vonda exited her vehicle and immediately approached the rear of the reversing car, raising her voice and signaling that the space was already claimed. The driver, noticing her proximity, applied the brake and brought the vehicle to a complete stop to avoid further movement. The engine remained running, and the vehicle stayed partially angled within the lane. Instead of stepping away from the path of the vehicle, Vonda remained directly behind it, continuing the confrontation. She moved backward incrementally as she spoke, maintaining eye contact with the other driver while gesturing toward the space, and refusing repeated attempts by the driver to disengage and continue reversing away. The rear wheels of the vehicle were positioned near a slight elevation change between the driving lane and the pedestrian curb edge. As the argument continued, Vonda shifted her weight backward without checking her footing. Her heel made contact with the raised concrete divider separating the lane from the sidewalk. She lost balance instantly as her heel caught the raised edge of the concrete wheel stop behind her. With her weight already shifted backward mid-step, there was no stable point to recover her footing. Her upper body tilted sharply in a continuous motion, driven by momentum rather than control, and she began to fall straight back toward the pavement. That split second is where everything stops being reversible, and there's no time left to correct positioning. As she went down, her head remained unprotected, with no reflexive movement to brake or slow the impact. The back of her skull struck the concrete wheel stop at close range, creating a direct, concentrated point of contact. The force of the impact was immediate, and her body followed through onto the ground without interruption. She collapsed fully onto the pavement and did not regain responsiveness, remaining motionless in the position where she fell. Bystanders called emergency services immediately. Nearby individuals moved to assist, but she remained unconscious at the scene. Paramedics arrived within minutes and initiated advanced medical response before transporting her to hospital care. Despite intervention, imaging confirmed a severe traumatic brain injury from blunt force impact to the occipital region, resulting in catastrophic internal damage and rapid loss of neurological function. She did not regain consciousness. The incident review, based on witness statements and surveillance footage, confirmed the fall occurred during active verbal escalation while she remained positioned within a vehicle's reversing path and adjacent curb boundary. A routine parking dispute escalates into a brief standoff in a crowded lot, where positioning becomes the critical factor in what follows, before the next case shifts into a different environment involving controlled mechanical systems under human interference. It was February 11th, 2017. A small nail and beauty salon in a strip mall in suburban Georgia was having a slow Saturday afternoon, the kind of place that does walk-ins, runs a few tanning beds in the back, and knows most of its regulars by name. 2 staff on shift, a handful of clients. Nothing unusual about the day until around 2:30 p.m. Feda Solis was 43 years old and worked as a property manager for a residential complex in the same suburb, the kind of job that gave her just enough authority over other people to make her insufferable everywhere else. She wasn't a regular at the salon, but she'd been in enough times that the staff knew her name and her reputation. She had a history of demanding discount, complaining about wait time, and had once left a written complaint at the front desk because a technician had been too quiet during her appointment. That kind of person. That Saturday, she came in without an appointment and asked to use the salon's industrial tanning bed, a commercial-grade unit in the back that ran at significantly higher UV output and internal temperature than a standard consumer bed. The salon's policy was straightforward. The industrial unit required a trained technician present for the entire session to monitor exposure time and the client's condition, no exception. The staff member at the front explained the policy. Feda told her it was unnecessary, that she'd used tanning beds her whole life, and that the policy was discriminatory. She demanded a manager. The senior staff member came out and said the exact same thing. Feda told her she didn't need a babysitter, accused them both of targeting her specifically, and threatened to report the salon for refusing service, loud enough that the waiting area had gone completely quiet. The senior staff member, worn down and not wanting it in front of everyone, caved, agreed to let Feda use the unit with check-ins every 15 minutes. Feda was shown to the back room and given the rundown. 12 minutes max, don't touch the settings, call out if anything feels off. She nodded like she had better things to think about. Before getting in, Feda adjusted the external control panel on the unit, cranking the UV intensity and the session timer well above the recommended level. The controls were on the outside of the bed, accessible before the session started. She apparently decided that more output meant faster results. Then she got in and fell asleep. The first check-in came at 15 minutes. The staff member knocked, cracked the door, asked if everything was okay. Feda told her to get out and stop hovering. Door pulled shut. The second check-in was due 15 minutes later, but 2 walk-ins arrived at the front at the same time. And once things settled, the staff member stepped out briefly to grab lunch from 2 doors down. Feda had already responded fine once. She assumed that was still the case. What nobody accounted for was that Feda had fallen asleep inside the unit, which had been running above its recommended settings for close to an hour at that point. Industrial tanning beds generate significant heat buildup at normal settings. At elevated output, that heat accumulates faster than the body can regulate, especially in someone who's unconscious and not moving. She never woke up. When the staff member returned, she got no response to her knock, opened the door, and found Feda unresponsive. Emergency services were called immediately and arrived within about 7 minutes. No pulse on arrival. Resuscitation was attempted on scene and continued en route, but it didn't matter. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner listed cause of death as cardiac arrest, secondary to severe hyperthermia. Prolonged exposure at the elevated settings had driven her core temperature high enough to trigger fatal arrhythmia, accelerated heart rate, circulatory collapse. No recovery. The external control panel log confirmed the settings had been changed from their defaults before she got in. 2 check-ins were documented, one refused by Feda herself. The staff member was reviewed, but with the client's own tampering, and her refusal of the first check-in, direct negligence couldn't be established. Ruled an accidental death, closed within 3 months.
It was April 9, 2016, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The backyard had been set up since mid-morning. Pastel balloons tied to the backs of folding chairs, a table with snacks and a decorated cake, and at the center of it, all a short section of PVC pipe mounted on a wooden base, loaded and ready. Ashley Monroe, 41, ran a parenting blog that she had been building for 4 years. She posted DIY projects, setups, family milestones, and the kind of carefully framed moments that looked effortless but took most of a Saturday to arrange. She had around 8,000 regular readers and a loyal following on social media. This was her 3rd child, and she wanted the reveal to be the best one yet. Something dramatic, something her readers would share. She'd been planning it for 3 weeks, and everything was going to go exactly the way she had pictured it. And look, I get that. I genuinely do. When you have built an audience around your family's moments, the pressure to make each one bigger than the last is real, and she was very clear about that. By the morning of the party, Ashley wasn't just organizing, she was directing. She corrected how the chairs were spaced, adjusted decorations other people had already set. When a relative suggested a simpler option, Ashley shut it down immediately. She said she wasn't doing basic for something this important. She had found a tutorial online for a homemade confetti cannon made from PVC pipe. The basic version used a manual pump or a small balloon. Ashley had found a modified version in the comments that used a CO2 cartridge for a bigger, faster burst. Several people said it worked perfectly. A few said not to do it. Ashley didn't just scroll past the warnings. She dismissed them out loud, calling them overdramatic and saying people online love to exaggerate risks when they didn't know what they were doing. And before I continue, let me say this: don't try everything you see online. It will save you a lot. Her husband was a mechanical engineer. When she showed him the design, he looked it over carefully and said he was not comfortable with it. He explained that consumer-grade PVC pipe was not designed to handle compressed gas, and that introducing a CO2 cartridge into a sealed section with glued joints could cause the pipe to fail under pressure. He told her she should use something made for the purpose. It would be safer, and it would still look good on camera. Ashley didn't take that as advice. She took it as pushback. She cut him off midway through his explanation and told him that plenty of people had used the exact same setup without any issues, and that she wasn't going to ruin the aesthetic with something bulky or store-bought. When he tried to explain further, she rolled her eyes and said not everything needed to turn into one of his technical lectures, especially over something this simple. He also told her again that it wasn't about opinion. It was about how the material behaved under pressure. Ashley responded by telling him he was overthinking it and making a problem where there wasn't one. She added that this was her event, her blog, and she knew what she was doing. She had spent 3 weeks planning this, and she was not changing it at the last minute because he was being cautious. This wasn't up for debate. She picked the device back up and said if he was not going to help, he could find somewhere else to be useful until the guests arrived. What gets me about that exchange is that he was a mechanical engineer. He was not guessing. He knew exactly what he was talking about, and she knew that. She just didn't want to hear it. He stood there for a moment longer, watching her. Then he stepped away. The pipe was standard consumer-grade PVC intended for household plumbing. It was not rated for compressed gas under any conditions. The joints were bonded with standard PVC adhesive. There was no pressure gauge. There was no relief valve. Nothing to regulate or limit what happened inside the pipe once the cartridge released. The only thing standing between the stored energy and the backyard was the pipe wall and the glued connections holding it together. Guests gathered and the phones went up. Ashley positioned herself right beside the device rather than stepping behind it, turning her body slightly toward the cameras so she would stay in frame. She reached for the trigger. There was no meaningful warning, nothing anyone could react to. She triggered the mechanism. Then this is when everything began to go wrong. The cartridge punctured and released rapidly into the sealed chamber, causing pressure to spike within a fraction of a second to a level the pipe was never built to survive. The glued joint near the base gave out first. The pipe shattered, sending rigid PVC shards outward at high velocity in every direction. Ashley was standing directly beside the failure point and slightly above it. A shard struck her in the face and head. The force of the fragmentation at that distance caused severe traumatic injury immediately. She collapsed as confetti dispersed around her. I have spent a lot of time with this case, and that last image is the one I cannot move past. Confetti in the air and Ashley on the ground. Guests called 911 immediately as people rushed to help and moved the children away. She was taken to a medical center, but despite surgery, she died from severe head trauma caused by high-velocity PVC shrapnel. Investigators examined the device and concluded the incident resulted from introducing unregulated compressed CO2 into a system built from non-pressure rated PVC materials with no pressure controls of any kind. The incident was ruled accidental.
It was July 16, 2016, in Napa Valley, California. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting golden light across the vineyards. An outdoor wedding reception was being held at a vineyard estate with approximately 140 guests in attendance. Valerie Hutchins, 38, was a real estate agent from San Francisco who specialized in luxury properties. She was known for walking out of listings that didn't meet her standards and had been asked to leave several open houses after making loud criticisms about staging choices. Friends who knew her well had learned to avoid inviting her to casual gatherings, as she had a habit of pointing out what she considered tacky decor or subpar catering. She had flown in specifically for this wedding and had complained about the parking situation and the lack of valet service. She also made pointed observations about what she considered poor planning, from the mismatched chair covers to the amateur floral arrangements. She had been drinking wine steadily since the cocktail hour began at 6 p.m., growing louder with each glass. Valerie wore a cocktail dress and heeled sandals. Her hands were damp from condensation on her wine glass and the humid evening air. She had no technical knowledge of generators or electrical systems. Approximately 10 minutes after confronting the staff member, Valerie walked away from her table toward the generator location. Several guests noticed her heading in that direction but did not follow. She moved behind the lattice panels where the generator sat on a rubber mat. The generator was running at full capacity, with multiple heavy-duty extension cords connected to its outlets. The unit's metal frame was grounded, but investigators later noted damage to the protective casing near the connection panel had exposed a live electrical point. Valerie gripped the generator's metal frame with both hands, attempting to drag or push it away from the seating area. The unit weighed approximately 200 pounds and did not move. She adjusted her grip, placing her right hand on the frame and her left hand near the electrical panel where the cords were connected. Her left hand made contact with an exposed terminal where the protective casing had cracked. The generator was actively supplying electrical power through its outlets. Investigators later determined she made contact with an exposed live connection, allowing current to pass through her body while her other hand remained on the metal frame. The electrical current caused immediate involuntary muscle contractions. Valerie's hands clenched tighter around the contact points, preventing her from releasing her grip. Her body went rigid, and she remained in contact with the generator for several seconds before collapsing backward onto the ground. A guest walking toward the restroom area saw Valerie fall and called out for help. Valerie was lying on her back, unresponsive and not breathing. Her hands showed visible burn marks. Guests immediately called emergency services while others began CPR, and the generator was shut off within about 90 seconds. Responders arrived 9 minutes later and continued resuscitation efforts, but Valerie never regained consciousness or a pulse. She was transported to a medical facility and pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The cause of death was cardiac arrest from electrical shock, with burn marks on both hands confirming sustained contact with a live electrical source. Investigators later determined a recently damaged casing had exposed energized components while the generator was running. The death was ruled accidental, and civil liability claims against the venue were eventually settled privately.
It was August 2015 in Lowndes County, Georgia. The late afternoon heat sat at 94 degrees Fahrenheit with the kind of humidity that makes the air feel like it has weight. The neighbor's property was a semi-rural lot set back from the road, partially fenced, with several large dogs kept in varying states of enclosure. It was the kind of property that looks different depending on who's looking at it, and Paula Dunmore had been looking at it closely and repeatedly for over 2 years. Paula Dunmore was 49, a retired county clerk, detail-oriented, persistent, and thorough in the way that people who spend careers managing official records tend to be. She had filed more than 20 formal complaints against her neighbor over that period, documenting what she believed was an unlicensed dog breeding operation running out of the property. Authorities had responded multiple times. Warnings had been issued. No animals had been removed and no operation had been shut down. I think most people in that situation would either accept the outcome or escalate through legal channels. Paula did neither. She started going over herself. She had begun conducting her own informal walkthroughs of the property, approaching unannounced, stepping past the fence line, photographing the kennels and counting animals. She brought a notepad and her phone. Nothing between her and the dogs except her certainty that she had every right to be there. The neighbor had asked her to stop on at least 2 separate occasions. She kept going. That afternoon, she stepped past the fence line again. An unsecured dog, vaccination history unknown and unverifiable, approached and bit her on the forearm. The wound was significant enough that she drove herself directly to the emergency room. I want to stop there for a second, because that decision was the right one. She didn't dismiss the bite. She didn't go home and wait it out. She went to the hospital. And that's what makes the next part so difficult to read. Intake staff documented the bite, noted the unknown vaccination status of the animal, and recommended immediate post-exposure prophylaxis. Because of high patient volume that day, she waited approximately 90 minutes without being formally seen by a physician. She left before treatment was administered, signing a form confirming she was leaving against medical advice. The intake record documented her stated reason: The weight was unacceptable, and she didn't believe the bite was serious enough to justify preventive treatment. Here's the thing about post-exposure prophylaxis for rabies that I didn't fully appreciate before researching this. The window it works in is the window before any symptoms appear. Once the virus reaches the central nervous system and clinical rabies begins, no treatment changes the outcome in any meaningful way. That's not a nuance buried in medical literature. It's the foundational fact of rabies exposure management. The treatment works when the virus is still traveling through the body toward the brain. Once it reaches that stage, survival becomes extremely unlikely. Paula left before the treatment started, and she left because she didn't want to wait. Roughly 6 weeks later, she developed fever, agitation, and difficulty sleeping. She returned to the hospital. By that visit, she was presenting with hydrophobia and confusion. Clinical rabies encephalitis had fully established. The dog was located, euthanized, and submitted for testing. Brain tissue examination confirmed a rabies-positive result. The incubation period was consistent with the bite location and the time elapsed. Paula died in hospital care within 10 days of her second admission. Confirmed cause was rabies encephalitis. The intake record from her first visit, including the form she signed on the way out, was recovered. Her complaint logs against the neighbor were also on file. Following her death, authorities conducted a full inspection of the property. Multiple animals were removed, and the operation was shut down. I've thought about that timing more than once. 2 years of complaints, and it took this to move it. I still don't know what to do with that.
It was June 14th, 2015, a Sunday, and the temperature in Lakewood, Ohio had reached 91 degrees by early afternoon. The community pool was open, occupied, and operating normally. Nothing about the day suggested a disruption beyond routine summer use. Deborah Foss, 54, had lived in the development for over 20 years and worked part-time at a local retail store. She held no HOA role, but frequently inserted herself into enforcement issues, filing 31 complaints in 18 months, none upheld. Residents described her as confrontational and controlling overshared spaces. She had mild hypertension, chronic plantar fasciitis, wore orthopedic sandals, and lived alone. The Washington family had moved in 8 months earlier. Renan, 38, was an electrician, and Nathania, 36, worked part-time at a pediatric clinic. They had 3 children, including 15-year-old Aliyah. Their dues were current, with full access to amenities. Deborah filed 4 complaints against them, none upheld. Aliyah began recording after repeated confrontations initiated by Deborah. The family arrived at the pool carrying towels and a cooler. Deborah was already seated near the entrance with a printed copy of the association bylaws, positioned to monitor entry. The pool was below its posted capacity. As the family approached, she stood immediately and moved to block the gate, placing herself directly in front of the latch. Without any authority, she told Renan that access needed to be confirmed and that the pool was at capacity. I didn't think much at first, but she got up so fast it felt like she'd been waiting for them, like the paper in her hand was already ready before they even reached the gate. Renan presented a valid membership card. Deborah examined it briefly and stated it appeared expired. She did not step aside. Instead, she remained fixed in place, continuing to assert control over entry. Other residents began watching. Deborah's voice grew louder as she repeated her claims, speaking over responses and preventing the situation from settling. Her posture became rigid. She maintained her position at the gate, using her body as a barrier. Renan remained measured and stated they were entering. When he reached toward the latch, Deborah reacted immediately, stepping forward and shoving him with both hands to the chest. The action was abrupt and not in response to any physical threat. Renan stepped backward onto the grass and maintained balance. He did not respond physically. Deborah remained at the gate, now standing on the narrow concrete drainage edge outside the entrance. The surface was wet from pool runoff and had a thin layer of algae. Her movement during the shove had shifted her weight forward beyond stable footing. Her left foot slipped outward, and her right foot failed to gain traction. Her body tilted backward. She was still holding the printed bylaws in one hand and did not reposition to break the fall. The back of her head struck the rounded edge of the pool, coping with significant force. Her body continued into the water face down. She did not attempt to recover or surface. Within seconds, the water around her head began to discolor, At first, it just looked like she slipped under normally until the stillness in her body made it clear something was wrong. Renan entered the pool and lifted her, keeping her face above water while calling for help. A lifeguard reached them shortly after and assisted in bringing her to the deck. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was initiated. Aaliyah continued recording as bystanders moved back. Emergency responders arrived and continued advanced care. Deborah was transported without regaining consciousness and was later pronounced dead. The cause of death was blunt force traumatic brain injury. The impact created a depressed fracture at the back of the skull, driving bone fragments into critical brain structures and causing immediate loss of consciousness and breathing. She was non-viable before entering the water, with drowning considered secondary. The wet surface and low traction from her footwear also contributed to the outcome. For privacy, the recording was removed from circulation. The Homeowners Association later reached a settlement with the Washington family over the handling of repeated complaints and ongoing disputes. The pool entrance was updated with a non-slip surface, and signage was added indicating all residents were permitted access. It was October 14, 2016. A hunting and outdoor sports expo was running for the weekend at a convention center in rural Tennessee, the kind of event that pulls vendors from 3 states over. Rows of display tables packed with crossbows, rifles, taxidermy mounts, hunting gear, you name it. Loud, crowded, and smelled like gun oil and sawdust the moment you walked in. Toni Colvin was 44 years old. She worked in insurance and had driven up from a neighboring county with 2 co-workers for what she described as a fun weekend outing. No background in archery, firearms, or hunting experience whatsoever. Toni had already been in a foul mood before they even arrived. She got into a screaming match with a stranger at a gas station over a parking spot on the drive up. And when the stranger didn't back down, she threatened to call the police over it. That kind of person. And that energy followed her straight through the front doors of that expo. Within the first 20 minutes inside, she had already complained to a front desk volunteer that the entrance layout was poorly organized, demanded a full printed vendor map after being told they had run out, and loudly accused a food stall worker of shortchanging her by 50 cents. Near the back of the main hall, one vendor was running a crossbow display. High draw weight competition models, the serious kind. He'd spent the morning setting up for a live accuracy demonstration at 2 p.m. One crossbow was already cocked and loaded on the mount for it. Bright orange safety flag in the rail, a placard right in front of it warning that it was loaded and not to be handled. Both standard practice for a live demo setup. Pretty hard to miss. Toni got to that table and made herself a problem within seconds. Grabbed an unloaded display bow without asking, dry-fired it, and when the vendor told her not to touch anything, she shoved past him toward the loaded crossbow. He cut her off, told her it was loaded and set for a demonstration. She got in his face, told him she wasn't a child, and he had no business telling her what she could and couldn't touch. He held his ground, and that's when she really turned it on, pulled out her phone and started filming him, telling him she'd make sure everyone saw how he treated women at his booth. A crowd had already stopped to watch. The vendor, rattled and not wanting it to spiral further, turned to a colleague at the next table for help. Maybe 15 seconds. That was all she needed. She pulled the orange safety flag out of the rail, dropped it on the table, and lifted the crossbow off the mount with both hands. The way witnesses described it, she had no idea what she was holding. Right hand around the stock, left hand drifting toward the trigger guard, as she tilted it to look at it from different angles. Her left index finger made contact with the trigger. The bolt discharged. The bolt struck her in the lower left jaw, punched through the floor of her mouth, perforated the left side of her trachea, and stopped somewhere in the soft tissue at the base of her neck. She dropped the crossbow and stumbled backward. Didn't go down immediately. Witnesses said she stood there for a few seconds with both hands at her throat before her legs gave out, and she dropped between 2 tables. Blood loss was fast. The bolt had hit both her airway and a major vessel at the same time. 2 catastrophic problems, 1 wound. Someone nearby with a military background got down and applied pressure. Another attendee called for emergency services. Nearest station was 12 minutes out. By the time they arrived, she'd been on the floor for close to 9 minutes, unresponsive. They worked on her there and continued en route, but it didn't matter. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, under 15 minutes from discharge to gone. The medical examiner confirmed penetrating neck trauma, tracheal rupture, and rapid exsanguination. The bolt had also caught a branch of the left external carotid artery, and while either injury alone might have been survivable with immediate surgery, not both, not on a convention hall floor. Contributing factors included her removal of the safety flag and complete unfamiliarity with the equipment. The vendor was cleared. Witness accounts and security footage confirmed he refused her twice and only turned away when she escalated. No charges were filed. The case was ruled an accidental death from self-inflicted mishandling of a loaded weapon and closed within 3 months.
It was June 11th, 2015, in Boca Raton, Florida. The afternoon shift at the salon on Palmetto Park Road was running the way it always did on a weekday. Every station occupied, dryers humming, conversations layered over each other across the room. The schedule was tight, and the staff had learned to move through it without much margin for anything unexpected. Denise Halpern, 55, was a real estate agent who had been selling properties in Boca for 12 years. She was good at her job, and she knew it. Colleagues described her as sharp, driven, and used to getting things done on her terms. That evening, she had one of the biggest open house showings of her quarter, a 4-bedroom waterfront property that had been sitting on the market for 2 months. She had spent the week preparing the listing, arranging staging furniture, and sending personal invitations to her top buyer contacts. First impressions mattered at a showing like this, and she intended to walk through that door, looking like someone who had everything under control. She had called ahead and booked a last-minute blowout, arriving at the salon at 4:10 in a cream blazer with her phone already in her hand and 45 minutes built into her schedule before she needed to leave. And look, I want to be clear about something. Denise was not an unreasonable person. She was under genuine pressure that evening. But then again, Karens don't know where to stop. The receptionist told her there was a 20-minute delay. The previous appointment had run over and her stylist was finishing up. Denise did not sit down. She asked why a booked appointment was being pushed back for someone who had gone over their time. The receptionist explained that the previous client had arrived late and the schedule had shifted. Denise said that was not her problem. She had a showing at 7 and she had booked specifically to have enough time. The receptionist said the stylist would be with her as soon as possible. Denise asked to speak with the manager. The manager came out and offered the same explanation. Denise said she understood the explanation and did not find it acceptable. A stylist working the next station over offered a compromise, suggesting she could begin the blowout while finishing the last steps of her current client. Denise agreed, though she made clear she expected the full service and expected it done properly. The blowout began. Within a few minutes, Denise was directing the process. She told the stylist the sectioning was wrong. She said the dryer felt too cold and was taking too long. The stylist explained the heat setting and said increasing it further risked damaging the hair. Denise said she had been getting blowouts for 20 years and she knew what her hair could handle. She reached up and adjusted the dryer controls herself, pushing the heat higher. The stylist moved her hand away from the controls and reset them. Denise adjusted them again. The stylist stopped working for a moment and said calmly that if the settings were changed again, she would not be able to continue the service safely. Denise told her to keep going. This is the part of the story I find hardest to sit with. Because the stylist tried, she said the words out loud, and Denise heard them and kept going anyway. Because of the constant adjustments and interruptions, the stylist had to reposition her setup to keep working, running a temporary extension cord from a nearby station. It passed behind the chair, close to where Denise had been shifting throughout the appointment. It was not part of the usual setup, but it allowed the service to continue under the conditions Denise insisted on. Denise's phone rang. She answered it and stepped back from the chair while talking, still complaining about the delay. She was moving without looking, distracted and mid-conversation. Her heel caught the extension cord. She lurched backward and reached for the chair, but missed. There was no break in the fall. Her full weight carried straight back, and the back of her head struck the lower metal frame behind her. The sound cut through the noise of the salon. What gets me about that moment is how fast it was. Staff called 911 immediately. Denise was conscious, but disoriented when paramedics arrived. Imaging confirmed a severe traumatic brain injury from the direct impact. She was admitted to intensive care and died 3 days later without regaining full consciousness. Unfortunately, she never made it to the house showing. Investigators classified the incident as an accidental fall involving environmental obstruction and active client interference during the service. The incident was ruled accidental.
It was August 11, 2016, in Phoenix, Arizona. Heat shimmered off the pavement as rush hour began. Interstate 10 was experiencing moderate traffic as commuters headed out of the city. Angela Merrick, 39, worked in administrative management for a regional logistics company and traveled frequently for short business trips. Colleagues described her as highly organized but easily frustrated when plans changed or schedules slipped. That afternoon, she had requested a rideshare to the airport for a 6:30 p.m. flight and was picked up from her downtown office at 4:45 p.m. From the moment she entered the vehicle, Angela complained about the car's temperature, the music volume, and the route shown on the navigation screen, reminding the driver she traveled often and expected rides to follow her instructions. She demanded a specific route despite his explanation that the app reflected current traffic conditions, interrupting him repeatedly and warning she would leave a negative rating if the route wasn't changed. She emphasized that she had important plans and could not afford delays, maintaining a dismissive tone throughout the exchange. Seated behind the driver, Angela repeatedly leaned forward to watch the navigation screen, questioning each turn while scrolling through her phone. As they merged onto the interstate, she again challenged the route and insisted on an alternate exit, raising her voice and stating the driver should follow customer instructions rather than the app's guidance. The driver politely declined. Angela became increasingly agitated, raising her voice and accusing him of intentionally delaying her trip. The driver remained calm and continued in the center lane. Angela unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned forward between the front seats, pointing at the navigation screen and demanding he change routes. The driver told her to sit back and refasten her seatbelt. She refused. Without warning, Angela reached over the driver's right shoulder and grabbed the steering wheel with both hands. She pulled it sharply to the right, attempting to force the car toward the exit. The driver immediately tried to regain control, pulling the wheel back while taking his foot off the accelerator. The car swerved into the right lane as a sedan braked and honked. The driver overcorrected, sending the vehicle back toward the center lane while he fought for control. Angela continued gripping the wheel, forcing it right again and pushing the car sharply toward the shoulder. The car's right front tire caught the edge where pavement met the raised shoulder. At approximately 55 miles per hour, the vehicle veered onto the shoulder. The driver attempted to straighten the wheel, but Angela's grip prevented correction. The car traveled approximately 40 feet along the shoulder before the right tires hit loose gravel. The vehicle became unstable and began rotating clockwise. Angela was thrown forward into the front cabin area as the car spun. The vehicle rotated approximately 120 degrees, and the passenger side struck a concrete support pillar at approximately 45 miles per hour. The impact crushed the rear passenger compartment where Angela's body was positioned. The driver was restrained by his seatbelt and deployed airbag. Angela was motionless, pinned between the front and back seats. Multiple witnesses stopped and called emergency services. First responders arrived within 8 minutes. The driver suffered a concussion, fractured ribs, and lacerations. Angela was unresponsive and trapped in the wreckage. Extraction took 22 minutes. She was transported to a medical facility but pronounced dead en route. The cause of death was massive internal injuries and severe thoracic trauma from the impact. Dash cam footage clearly showed Angela grabbing the steering wheel and causing the loss of control. Her seatbelt was unbuckled at the time of the crash. The case was ruled an accidental death, with Angela's actions determined to be the direct cause. The rideshare driver was not charged and cleared of any wrongdoing.
It was June 2015 in Tucson, Arizona. The afternoon heat outside had pushed past 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of dry desert heat that makes every air-conditioned room feel like a relief the moment you walk through the door. The restaurant was at full lunch capacity, tables close together, the room loud with midday service. Sandra had come in for a late lunch, bringing Cooper with her as she routinely did despite repeated pushback from staff in similar places. I've thought about what that room must have felt like to walk into, and I think that matters more than it seems. Sandra Fielding was 46, an office manager, confident, vocal, and by all accounts, someone who did not back down from confrontation easily. She had owned a mixed-breed golden retriever named Cooper for 6 years. Cooper wore a service vet she had purchased online. He had no task training, no certification, no behavioral conditioning specific to any medical or accessibility. For 3 years, Sandra had been bringing him into restaurants, grocery stores, and retail locations, and when staff questioned her, she did not quietly comply. She filmed it. She posted the video, she made it a pattern, and she made it public. I want to be clear that I'm not touching the broader conversation about service animal access here. Genuine service animals are a different subject entirely. What I'm talking about is one specific situation with one specific outcome. What makes this case different from a story about someone bending the rules is what was sitting in Sandra's medical file the entire time. Her allergy to dog dander and saliva had been documented since 2009. A follow-up in 2013 noted that the sensitivity had worsened. Her physician had recommended she carry an epinephrine auto-injector. The prescription was written. It was never filled. Sandra's position, as far as anyone who knew her could tell, was that Cooper specifically didn't affect her, and for 6 years of daily low-level exposure, that had been more or less true. I think that's the part of this story I find most difficult to reason through, because 6 years of being fine is a very convincing argument to make to yourself, until it isn't. Here's something I looked into specifically because I wanted to understand how this could escalate so fast after years of nothing. The dose of allergen matters. Daily ambient exposure to a dog you live with is a fundamentally different load on the immune system than direct contact with saliva on your face and neck. That distinction isn't subtle from a biological standpoint. It's the difference between background noise and a trigger. And that's exactly what happened when Cooper jumped up during the confrontation. Sandra and Cooper were seated without immediate issue. A server approached quietly and asked to see documentation. Sandra stood up and the confrontation began. Raised voice, escalating toward a manager. During it, Cooper jumped up against her, making direct contact with her face and neck. Within minutes, she was describing itching around her eyes and a tightening in her throat. She kept going. I don't think anyone in that room understood what they were watching until it was already too late. Hives appeared across her neck and chest. Her breathing became audibly labored. People called for emergency services. Sandra lost consciousness before they arrived. Without epinephrine in those first critical minutes, the reaction had nothing to stop it, and her prescription had never been filled, so there was nothing on her, nothing in her bag, nothing that could have immediately countered the reaction. Sandra was pronounced dead at the hospital. Confirmed cause was anaphylactic shock triggered by dog allergen exposure. Her medical records confirmed the documented allergy and its progression. Prescription records confirmed the auto-injector was never filled. Witness statements from staff and several diners were collected, and security footage timestamps were consistent. Cooper was surrendered to animal control that same day. He was not euthanized. No liability was assigned to the restaurant. Case closed. I've gone back through this one more than most, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. The allergy was documented. The prescription existed. The recommendation was clear. Every piece of information she needed to protect herself had already been handed to her, and she made a different decision every time it came up. Not out of ignorance, out of certainty that it wouldn't matter. For 6 years, that certainty held. Then it didn't.
It was July 18th, 2014, and the back patio of a house on a residential street in Roswell, Georgia, was being used for routine food preparation for a small catering job. The evening was warm and quiet, and the setting was otherwise ordinary for residential use. Patrice Dunham, 52, had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and served on an architectural review committee where she frequently submitted objections regarding landscaping, fencing, and outdoor decor. She worked part-time as a bookkeeper and had no elected authority within the community. I don't think it takes official power for people to start acting like they have it. Over the previous year, she had filed multiple complaints against a neighboring family regarding noise, parking, and alleged violations related to home-based business activity, all of which had been dismissed. She had also been formally asked to stop directly confronting residents after repeated disputes. She had a known severe allergy to tree nuts and carried emergency medication for it, which she was aware was critical in exposure situations. The Nguyen family operated a permitted home catering business specializing in Vietnamese cuisine. That evening, they were preparing a dessert that included crushed walnuts as an ingredient. The food preparation area was set up in the backyard, with ingredients organized on a table. Family members were present in different parts of the home, with the catering work ongoing and undisturbed prior to the incident. Patrice entered the property through an unlocked side gate without prior notice or invitation. She began recording and verbally stating that she was documenting what she believed to be a violation of community rules. She approached the food preparation area despite being told to leave. Her behavior escalated from observation to direct interference as she engaged with the ingredients on the table. She picked up a bowl containing crushed walnuts and handled it while continuing to record. When instructed again to stop and leave the property, she remained focused on documenting the scene. She then touched the contents directly with her fingers and brought them close to her face, continuing to speak as she handled the bowl. In the process, she transferred residue from her fingers to her mouth and lips. For individuals with severe sensitivity, even small amounts introduced this way can trigger a rapid and life-threatening reaction. Shortly after the contact, she began showing signs of distress. Her speech became interrupted, and she indicated that something was wrong. Visible swelling developed around her lips and face within moments. She retrieved emergency medication from her bag, but struggled to use it effectively. During the escalation of symptoms, others present attempted to assist. Even when help is right there, execution under panic is a completely different situation. The medication was ultimately administered after a short delay, but the reaction continued to progress. Emergency services were contacted and arrived within minutes. She was conscious, but in severe respiratory distress with restricted airflow and rapidly declining oxygen levels. She was treated on site, transported for advanced care, and remained in intensive care but did not regain neurological function. Life support was later withdrawn. The cause of death was anaphylactic shock from exposure to tree nut allergens, involving rapid airway constriction, vascular collapse, and reduced oxygen delivery to vital organs. Medical evaluation noted that the delayed use of emergency medication contributed to the outcome, though symptoms had already reached a critical stage before effective intervention. Authorities reviewed the incident and found no grounds for charges. The catering operation was confirmed to be compliant with local regulations, and prior complaints against the property had been previously dismissed, leading to case closure. It was July 22, 2016. A county fairground in Central Texas was packed for its annual two-day rodeo, the kind of event that draws the whole town out. Bleachers full, vendors lining the perimeter, kids running around with funnel cake. Loud, dusty, and hot. Temperatures that afternoon were sitting around 97 degrees Fahrenheit, and the arena floor was dry, packed dirt that hadn't seen rain in weeks. Anna Holsk was 47 years old and worked in human resources for a mid-sized company in Austin. If you've ever met someone who treated every rule like a personal inconvenience designed specifically for them, that was Anna. She'd driven out to the fairground that afternoon with a co-worker and had already gotten into it with a parking attendant before they even made it through the gate. By the time they found their seats, she'd complained to two different volunteers about the seating arrangement and demanded to be moved closer to the arena floor. They told her the sections were assigned. She sat down, but she wasn't done. Rodeo arenas at county-level events are divided by a series of gates and fencing that separate spectator areas from the active competition floor. The gates closest to the arena are strictly off-limits during active events, not suggestions, actual hard barriers that exist, because the animals on that floor are unpredictable, and the space near the chutes is not safe during a ride. At this particular event, a single volunteer was managing the gate on the east side of the arena during active segment. About an hour into the event, a transition was happening between two riding segments. The volunteer managing the east gate had stepped about 15 feet away to help carry equipment to the other side of the arena. The gate was closed but unlatched, held in place by its own weight. That gap in coverage lasted maybe 2 minutes. Anna had been watching that gate. She'd already tried to get closer to the arena floor twice, once by asking a volunteer to let her through who refused, and once by leaning over the railing for a better photo angle before being told to step back. When she saw the volunteer step away, she moved immediately. She pushed the gate open, slipped through, and walked onto the dirt floor about 20 feet from the active shoot area. Phone out, like she'd earned it. What she didn't know was that the next segment had already been cued. A 1,100-pound quarter horse that had been agitated in the chute for several minutes was released seconds after she stepped onto the floor. The rider was thrown within the first few seconds, which left the horse loose with no handler in immediate reach. A loose, agitated horse in an enclosed arena with an unfamiliar figure standing in the open is going to react, and it did. It veered sharply toward her at full gallop. She had no time to move. The horse struck her with its chest and right shoulder, knocked her off her feet, and sent her into the arena fencing at the perimeter. She hit the lower metal rail at the back of her head and upper neck. She didn't get up. The horse was corralled by arena staff within about 30 seconds. Workers reached her within a minute. She was unresponsive, no movement. Emergency services were called immediately and arrived within about 9 minutes given the fairground's proximity to town. No pulse on arrival. Resuscitation was attempted on scene and continued en route, but it didn't matter. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner confirmed traumatic brain injury as the cause of death from blunt force impact, with a cervical fracture at C2 as a contributing factor. The horse strike caused the fall, but the fatal injuries came from hitting that fence rail. Death would have been near instantaneous from the cervical fracture alone. The volunteer was cleared. Witness accounts and security footage confirmed he'd stepped away briefly for a legitimate reason, and that Anna had pushed through a closed gate without authorization. Anna's co-worker confirmed her repeated attempts to access the arena floor throughout the afternoon. No negligence found on the part of the event or its staff. Ruled an accidental death. Closed within 6 weeks.
It was March 6th, 2015, in Beaver Creek, Ohio. The afternoon shift at the grocery store on Fairfield Road was winding down the way it always did at that hour, the checkout lanes thinning out, the overhead lights humming over empty conveyor belts. It was the kind of afternoon where nothing was supposed to happen. Sharon Whitaker, 54, was a substitute teacher at an elementary school in the district. Friends and colleagues described her as someone who did not let things go. She was the kind of person who read the fine print, kept her receipts, and followed up on every complaint she ever filed. She was organized, and she was persistent, and she believed strongly that if something was wrong, it was worth saying so. That afternoon, she had driven to the store to pick up supplies for her daughter's birthday party the following weekend. Her daughter was turning 9, and Sharon had been planning the party for 2 weeks. She had a list, balloons in the colors her daughter had asked for, a chocolate cake mix, and the frosting to go with it, paper plates and napkins, and a bag of candy for the party games. She had worked it all out, and she knew roughly what it was going to cost. And look, this is just a mom trying to give her daughter a good birthday. That is the full context of why she was in that store. A few weeks earlier, she had clipped a coupon from the Sunday Circular. It was for a few dollars off a grocery purchase over a certain amount, and she had held on to it in the small zippered pocket of her purse specifically for this trip. She was not going to pay full price when she had a coupon. That was not how Sharon Whitaker did things. She loaded her items onto the belt, set her purse on the small ledge at the end of the register, and placed the coupon face up next to her loyalty card. The cashier picked it up, scanned it, and set it back down on the belt. The coupon had expired 3 weeks earlier. Sharon looked at it. She told the cashier that she had clipped it recently and that the store should honor it. The cashier explained that the system would not accept an expired coupon and that there was nothing she could do. Sharon asked for a manager. The cashier called for one over the intercom. While they waited, Sharon told the cashier that a little flexibility would go a long way and that this was exactly the kind of thing that made people stop shopping at certain stores. The cashier kept her eyes on the register, and this is the part where I keep thinking, just leave the items, just walk out. But that was not Sharon. The manager arrived a few minutes later. He was a man in his early 30s with a store lanyard and a patient expression that Sharon apparently did not find reassuring. He looked at the coupon. He confirmed it was expired. Sharon said the expiration date was printed so small that a person would need a magnifying glass to read it, and that this was a store problem, not a customer problem. She told him she had been shopping at this location for 11 years. She told him she spent a significant amount of money there every month. He offered her a small discount on a future purchase as a goodwill gesture. Sharon said that was not the same as honoring the coupon, and she did not accept it. She asked for the name of the shift supervisor. The manager stepped away from the register to make a phone call. Several minutes passed. The customers who had been waiting behind Sharon had quietly moved to other lanes. She remained where she was. When the manager came back, the answer was the same. The coupon could not be accepted. Sharon took a pen from her purse and wrote the supervisor's name on the back of the coupon. She told the manager that corporate would be hearing from her. She left her items on the belt and walked toward the exit. On her way out, she told the cashier that some people had no business working with the public. The entrance to the store had been mopped as part of routine floor cleaning during the late afternoon lull. A yellow wet floor sign had been placed in the center of the walkway, just inside the sliding doors. Sharon had walked straight through it on her way out, kicking it aside with her foot without slowing down, muttering that it was in the way. The sign tipped and came to rest at an angle near the edge of the mat. The floor was still wet. The sign was no longer centered in the walkway. What gets me is that she had already won the argument in her head before she even reached the door. She was done. She was leaving. And then something made her turn around. Sharon came back through the sliding doors just as immediately as she left. She had thought of something else she wanted to say. She came in fast, already talking, her eyes on the register at the far end of the lane. Her left foot came down on the damp tile, just past the entrance mat. The sole of her shoe found no grip on the wet surface. Her foot went forward and her body went straight back. She had no time to react and nothing to grab onto. The back of her head struck the tile floor directly. The sound carried to the nearest checkout lane. She did not move after that. Staff called 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Sharon unresponsive near the entrance. She was transported to a medical center where imaging confirmed a severe traumatic brain injury from the impact. She was admitted to intensive care. Sharon Whitaker died 2 days later without regaining consciousness. Her daughter's birthday party was never held that weekend. Investigators classified the incident as an accidental fall involving a displaced safety warning in a recently cleaned area. The incident was determined to be accidental.
It was March 14th, 2015, in Portland, Oregon. Rain misted the streets as the city came to life. A multi-story renovation project had been underway for 3 weeks in a mixed commercial district. Marla Dennison, 41, owned a boutique 2 buildings down from the construction site and had built the business from scratch over 6 years. She took pride in creating a calm, upscale atmosphere for her customers and viewed the construction as a personal attack on her livelihood. For weeks, she had complained about the noise disrupting her customers. She left aggressive written complaints taped to the fence and had confronted workers during breaks, calling them inconsiderate and unprofessional. That morning, after particularly loud jackhammer noise, she told her assistant she was going to handle it herself, since no one took her seriously. Around 10:20 a.m., Marla closed her store temporarily and walked toward the construction site. She wore business casual clothing and carried her phone. Witnesses later reported she appeared agitated and was looking up at the building as she approached. The entrance gate was partially open where a delivery truck had just exited. A worker near the gate was occupied with paperwork and had his back turned. Marla had no construction experience and no hard hat or safety vest. The site's active work zones included overhead crane operations, and loads were being moved across the upper floors at irregular intervals. Marla walked past the open gate without announcing herself or waiting for clearance. She moved approximately 40 feet into the site, navigating around stacked materials and equipment. Her focus remained upward, toward the source of the noise on the 3rd floor. A crane operator on the 4th floor was repositioning a load of steel I-beams bundled together, weighing roughly 600 pounds. The load was being moved horizontally across the building's exterior before being lowered to the ground-level staging area. The operator had a limited view of the ground directly below due to the angle and building structure. Marla stopped in the center of the staging area, still looking upward. She raised her phone, appearing to record or photograph the work above. A ground crew member approximately 50 feet away noticed her and began moving in her direction, waving his arms. The crane load swung slightly as it cleared the building edge, a normal movement during repositioning. The operator began the descent, following the planned path to the staging area. The load was approximately 30 feet above ground when it entered Marla's vicinity. The ground crew member shouted, but machinery noise masked his voice. Marla remained stationary, looking at the wrong floor. The beams descended at approximately 2 feet per second. At 15 feet above ground, the load entered Marla's peripheral vision. She looked up and stepped backward instead of moving laterally. The beams struck her head and upper body directly. She collapsed immediately under the weight and did not move. Work stopped within seconds. The ground crew reached her within 30 seconds and lifted the beams, but she was unresponsive with severe visible trauma. Emergency services arrived within 7 minutes and pronounced her dead at the scene. The cause of death was massive blunt force trauma to the head and chest, with skull fracture and crushing injuries. Investigators reviewed safety protocols, crane logs, and witness statements. Security footage confirmed Marla had entered without authorization into a clearly marked active work zone. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by unauthorized entry. The construction company was in compliance with safety regulations but implemented additional gate security measures. Marla's family did not pursue legal action.
It was October 2015 in Rutherford County, Tennessee. The fellowship hall was warm and brightly lit, the kind of room that always smells like coffee and folding tables regardless of what's being served. It was a mild fall afternoon, around 64 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and most members had driven short distances with their dishes already prepared. The hall had no commercial refrigeration. Dishes were held on warming trays or left at room temperature, the same setup the congregation had used for years without incident. Ann Ketterman was 58, a longtime church member who had gradually and informally taken control of the monthly potluck over a period of years. She had no food handling certification, no culinary training, nothing that would give her authority in any official sense. But she had presence, and she had been doing this long enough that people had stopped pushing back. Every dish got looked at before it hit the table. Every dish got an opinion. I've known people like Ann, not in a church context, but in offices, in group settings, where someone decides the rules should run through them first. It's a very specific kind of person, and I think most people have a face in their head right now. That month, a woman named Maureen Abels brought a green bean casserole. Maureen was 67 and had been a member of that congregation for over 2 decades. She had made the same dish, the same way, for years. Ann rejected it in front of other members. The texture was wrong. The temperature was off. She sent Maureen back to reheat it, then sent her back again, then directed her to scrap it and remake it using Ann's own instruction, which included a low, slow reheat in a covered dish that sat in the church kitchen for 2 hours before being brought back out. I want to be precise about that, because it's not incidental. It's the whole mechanism. Here's what I didn't fully understand until I went through the food safety documentation. Clostridium botulinum thrives in low-acid, low-oxygen environments. Exactly what you get inside a covered cream-based casserole repeatedly warmed and cooled without reaching a temperature high enough to neutralize it. Botulinum toxin is destroyed by sufficient heat. The original dish, prepared and served in a single pass, didn't create the same conditions for toxin development. The remake did. 2 hours in a covered dish on a low warmer can keep food in a temperature range where the toxin isn't destroyed, not hot enough to neutralize it, and not cold enough to slow bacterial activity. Nobody designed it that way. That's what makes it so hard to look away from. Ann was the first to serve herself from the final version. The potluck continued, and nobody reported feeling unwell that afternoon. That's consistent with how botulinum toxin, it doesn't present immediate. Between 18 and 36 hours later, Ann began experiencing fatigue and blurred vision. By the following day, she had difficulty swallowing and a drooping heaviness in her face and neck that moved downward through her limbs. She believed she had a stomach bug. By the time a family member found her unable to stand and called for help, The toxin had progressed to a point where early intervention was no longer straightforward. The detail that hits hardest when I go back through this is that Maureen ate from the original dish, so did at least one other member served before Anne intervened. Neither of them got sick. Health authorities tested both versions. The original returned clean. The remake did not. That result is documented. It's not ambiguous. Anne died in hospital care 4 days after the potluck. Confirmed cause was botulinum toxin poisoning. Food samples from both versions were tested and the findings were clear. Congregation members were interviewed, Maureen among them. No negligence was assigned to her. Everything in the remake had been done under Anne's direct instruction. The case closed without further action. The original dish was fine. I've read that finding several times, and I still don't quite know what to do with it. She rejected something that was fine, replaced it with something that wasn't, and was the first person to eat it.
It was August 9, 2016, and a domestic flight was still at the gate at a major airport. The aircraft had not pushed back, and boarding was still being finalized. The cabin was stationary, with passengers settling into their seats and overhead bins still in use. Nothing about the situation had yet transitioned into flight operations. Gail Murchison, 55, worked in real estate in Aurora, Colorado. She had been licensed for over a decade and operated a small independent practice with modest sales performance. She traveled infrequently by air and had booked a middle seat assignment in row 22 for a business-related trip to Orlando. She had consumed alcohol before boarding at the terminal and was traveling alone. Seat 22F, the window seat in that row, was assigned to Noah Castillo, a 9-year-old child traveling alone to visit family. His seat assignment had been confirmed in advance, including the window position requested due to motion sensitivity. He wore an identification lanyard indicating he was traveling alone and was escorted during boarding. Gail boarded and proceeded to row 22, where she found the window seat unoccupied and sat there instead of her assigned middle seat. She stored her belongings and remained seated. When Noah arrived with a gate escort and identified his seat, he stated that he believed the window seat was his. Gail did not acknowledge the clarification and instructed him to sit in the middle seat instead. The escort explained that the assignment was fixed and that the child was traveling alone. Gail refused to move and insisted the seating arrangement did not concern her. The child became visibly distressed and remained standing in the aisle as the situation stalled. A flight attendant was called to the row and reiterated that the seat assignment had to be followed. Gail continued to refuse, stating she had paid for her ticket and would not relocate. Her tone escalated, and she remained seated in the incorrect seat while the conflict continued. This is the point where you can feel the entire row starting to tighten up around what's happening. As the interaction progressed, Gail stood up into the aisle, not to comply, but to continue arguing. She stepped toward the crew member and made contact with their lanyard, pulling it forward during the exchange. The action caused a brief loss of balance before recovery against the seat armrest. The situation escalated further in the confined aisle space, with passengers observing from nearby rows. As the interaction continued, Gail turned away from the crew member and reached upward toward the overhead compartment above her row, pulling at the latch while still speaking. The compartment door released and swung downward in its standard motion, but her position directly beneath it left no space to avoid it. The edge of the door struck the side of her head at close range. The impact disrupted her balance in the narrow aisle, and she fell sideways, striking the armrest before her head hit the floor. The secondary impact was direct and unbroken. She did not regain responsiveness. Crew members initiated an emergency response while medical personnel on board assisted within moments. She was found unconscious with abnormal pupil response and signs consistent with severe head trauma. The aircraft remained at the gate while emergency services were requested. She was transported for advanced medical treatment. In situations like this, everything shifts into procedure mode, even while the cabin is still full of people watching in silence. Medical evaluation identified a severe intracranial bleed caused by blunt force trauma sustained during the fall, primarily from impact with the armrest and floor. The impact resulted in a fractured bone and damage to a major artery beneath the skull, causing rapid internal pressure on the brain. Despite surgical intervention to relieve the pressure and remove the blood clot, the brain injury had already progressed to irreversible damage. She later died from complications related to the injury. The cause of death was determined to be acute epidural hematoma resulting from blunt force head trauma. The manner of death was classified as accidental. The outcome was influenced by the location of impact on a structurally vulnerable area of the skull and the rapid onset of intracranial bleeding. The passenger who opened the overhead compartment was questioned and cleared of wrongdoing. Airline personnel had followed standard boarding and seating procedures, and the seating conflict was identified as the initiating factor in the sequence of events. The child was later rebooked and continued his travel. It was August 19, 2017. The Gauley River in West Virginia was running high that weekend. Late summer releases from the upstream dam had the water moving fast, and the rapids sitting at the upper end of their classification. The kind of conditions that draw serious whitewater paddlers from across the country, but have absolutely no business being anyone's first time on moving water. Mela Druce was 36 years old, a real estate agent out of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of person who treated every interaction like a negotiation she was determined to win. She'd driven down with 4 friends for a long weekend, the plan being a guided rafting trip on the lower section of the river, a Class 3 run the outfitter had recommended for their experience level. On the drive down, she'd already complained about the route, argued with the GPS, and berated a gas station attendant for not carrying the brand of water she wanted. By the time they pulled into the outfitter's lot, she'd already decided she was the most qualified person in the group to make decisions, including ones that weren't hers to make. The outfitter ran guided trips on the lower section only. The upper section, which included a stretch of Class 4 rapids, was off limits and posted as such at the launch area. The staff had been running that river for years and knew exactly what those upper rapids did to unprepared paddlers at high water. During the equipment briefing, the guide went through the standard safety rundown: paddle technique, capsizing protocol, how to read the water. Mela interrupted him twice, told him she already knew how to kayak, and pushed for the upper section instead. He shut it down. Wrong trip, wrong certification level, wrong conditions. She told him he was being overly cautious and that she hadn't driven 4 hours for a beginner route. A woman with 1 lake tour under her belt arguing with a certified river guide. What could go wrong? He didn't budge. She dropped it. But the energy she was carrying into the water was obvious to everyone standing there. While the guide was helping another member adjust their gear, Mela dragged a solo kayak from the equipment rack, carried it to the water 30 feet upstream from the group, and got in. No guide, no safety check, no word to anyone. The guide turned around and told her firmly to get out. She waved him off, said she'd meet them downstream, and pushed off, just like that. The current caught her immediately and pulled her faster than she expected. She was paddling but didn't have the technique or the strength to hold her line. Within about 4 minutes, she'd been carried past the boundary marker buoys and into the upper section. The first significant rapid in that stretch is a Class 4 drop with a hydraulic feature at the base, a recirculating current that forms where fast water pours over a submerged ledge and curls back on itself. Paddlers call it a hole. At high water, the hole on that particular rapid becomes what's known as a keeper hydraulic, strong enough to trap a swimmer and cycle them back into the turbulence repeatedly, rather than flushing them downstream. It doesn't let go easily. Mela's kayak entered the rapid without any corrective line. She hit the hydraulic at the base, and the boat flipped immediately. She was ejected within seconds. Without proper technique to roll the boat upright, there was no recovery. The hydraulic held her in the recirculating current. She was underwater more than she was above it. Her friends had seen her go past the boundary markers, and the guide had already radioed for help. Responders were on the water within about 18 minutes, but river access to that section was limited. By the time they reached the hydraulic, she was no longer visible in the recirculation. Her body was recovered about 400 yards downstream later that afternoon, after the current pattern shifted and flushed her out. Water temperature that day was around 58 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to shut down muscle function within minutes, meaning even if she'd cleared the hydraulic on her own, it probably wouldn't have mattered. The medical examiner confirmed drowning as the cause of death, with cold water immersion and physical exhaustion as contributing factors. No impact injuries. The hydraulic just held her until there was nothing left to hold. The outfitter was cleared. Radio logs and statements from all 4 friends confirmed the same sequence. Warned, refused, launched alone. The kayak turned up downstream the next morning. Accidental death. Case closed in 6 weeks.
It was July 18th, 2015, in Henderson, Nevada. The desert evening had settled over the HOA community on Pinecrest Drive the way it always did in summer, the heat dropping slowly after sundown and the air going still and quiet. In a neighborhood like this one, where the houses sat close together and the streets were empty by 9, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows each other. Deborah Klein, 53, had lived in the community for 7 years and had served as HOA treasurer for the last 4 of them. People who knew her described her as detail-oriented and committed to the rules that kept the community running the way it was supposed to. She attended every board meeting, filed every form correctly, and expected her neighbors to follow the same standards she held herself to. She was not the kind of person who let something slide. And I want to be fair to Deborah here, because on paper, none of that sounds unreasonable. The problem was what happened when the system told her no. The wind chimes had been hanging on her neighbor's back porch for years. They were not particularly loud. On most nights, you would not notice them unless you were standing right next to the fence. The other neighbors on the street had lived alongside them for years without a single complaint, but Deborah had decided she did not like them, and that was enough. She walked next door one evening and knocked. When her neighbor answered, Deborah told her the chimes needed to come down. Her neighbor said they had been there for years and asked politely what the problem was. Deborah's voice went up. She told her neighbor that the sound was disruptive and inconsiderate, and that a person who actually cared about the people around her would have taken them down already. Her neighbor tried to respond, but Deborah kept talking, her voice getting louder, her finger pointing toward the backyard. Her neighbor said she was not going to stand on her own porch and be spoken to that way, and closed the door. That's exactly what I would do if I was the neighbor. I won't watch you stand on my porch yell at me. Deborah stood there for a moment. Then she walked home and filed a formal HOA complaint the next morning, then a second, then a third. She wrote each one carefully, documented the dates and times she claimed to have been disturbed, and submitted them through the proper channels. Each one was reviewed. Each time the determination came back the same. The wind chimes did not meet the threshold for a noise violation under the community's governing documents. They were not loud enough. They were not frequent enough. The board could not take action. And this is where it starts to get uncomfortable, because most people accept that answer and move on. Deborah did not. The final rejection letter arrived on July 15th. Deborah read it twice and put it in her HOA folder. 3 days passed. The chimes were still there. Her neighbor had not spoken to her since the night she closed the door. The board had done nothing. Nobody was going to do anything. Deborah decided she would handle it herself. On the evening of July 18th, shortly after 11, Deborah walked to the back of her property carrying a small step stool. The fence between her yard and her neighbor's was a standard 6-foot wooden privacy fence. She placed the stool against the base, climbed up, swung her leg over the top, and dropped down onto the other side. She landed awkwardly, her right wrist taking the full impact as she tried to catch herself. The pain was immediate. She left the yard without touching the chimes and drove herself to the emergency room at a hospital, where she was treated for a hairline fracture of the wrist and discharged with a brace and instructions to rest it for at least a week. And what gets me is that at this point, she had a broken wrist. It should have been the moment she let it go. But guess what happened next? She was back at the fence the following night. The doctor had told her to rest the wrist and keep the brace on for at least a week. By the following evening, she had already decided it was not that bad. The chimes were still there. A sore wrist was not going to change any of that. She went slower this time, more careful at the top, more deliberate about how she was going to come down on the other side. What gets me is that she had thought it through, and this is what she came up with. The chimes were right there, maybe 8 feet away, hanging from a hook on the porch overhang. She got to the top of the fence and swung her leg over. Her foot reached for the ground on the other side. She misjudged the distance in the dark. Her foot came down short, and she lost her balance, pitching forward with nothing to grab onto. She fell forward and down, and her head struck the decorative stone edging that ran along the base of her neighbor's garden bed. The stones were fixed in place and had no give. The impact was direct. She did not get up. She was found the following morning after she failed to respond to calls and a neighbor requested a welfare check. Officers and paramedics entered the yard and found Deborah on the ground near the fence line. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as traumatic brain injury sustained from the fall. She was 53 years old. Investigators determined the incident resulted from unauthorized entry onto private property during a second attempt to remove an object that had been the subject of a failed complaint process. And guess what? The wind chimes were still hanging on the neighbor's porch when officers arrived that morning. They were intact. They were undisturbed.
It was November 3rd, 2015, in Denver, Colorado. Frost clung to the grass as the sun climbed higher. A residential neighborhood of single-family homes had been experiencing intermittent natural gas service issues due to aging infrastructure. Rita Drummond, 52, had lived in her two-story home for 14 years and worked part-time doing bookkeeping from home. She had a history of disputes with service providers, convinced most were trying to overcharge her or create unnecessary work. Neighbors described her as someone who believed she knew better than the experts and wasn't afraid to say so. That day, she was home alone when a technician arrived around 9:15 a.m. to inspect her gas meter. He identified a faulty pressure regulator and recommended shutting off the gas supply until repairs could be completed later that day. Rita became immediately confrontational, insisting her appliances worked fine and accusing him of creating unnecessary work to charge more money. She threatened to call his supervisor to complain. The technician shut off the main gas valve, tagged it with a warning label, and instructed her not to tamper with it. Rita stood visibly angry, criticizing him throughout. After the technician left, Rita remained outside near the meter, which was located on the exterior wall near her basement entrance. She had basic familiarity with the valve system from previous service calls and believed the technician had dramatically overreacted. Approximately 15 minutes after the technician departed, Rita returned to the gas meter. She removed the warning tag and used a wrench from her garage to reopen the main valve, turning it slowly until it opened fully. Gas began flowing into the basement through the supply line, but without the pilot light ignited, it began accumulating in the enclosed space. The basement had minimal ventilation, one small closed window, and no active exhaust system. The faulty regulator caused gas to flow at a higher rate than normal. Rita spent approximately 12 minutes upstairs before noticing the house felt colder. She went to the basement to check the furnace. As she descended the stairs, the concentration of natural gas in the air had reached a flammable level. The gas, which contained an added odorant, was now detectable, but Rita had already entered the space. Rita reached the furnace and attempted to relight the pilot manually using the built-in ignition button. The electrical spark from the ignition mechanism triggered an immediate explosion. The blast originated at the furnace and expanded rapidly through the basement, fueled by the accumulated gas. The explosion blew out the basement windows and caused the first floor to partially collapse into the basement. Rita was at the epicenter and was thrown against the concrete foundation wall. The force caused severe structural damage to the home and ignited a fire that spread through the debris. A neighbor 2 houses away heard the explosion and called emergency services immediately. First responders arrived within 6 minutes. The house was heavily damaged, with active fire in the basement and first floor areas. Firefighters extinguished the blaze within 35 minutes and entered the basement once it was deemed structurally safe. Rita was found near the furnace area, severely injured and unresponsive. She was extracted and transported to a medical facility but was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The cause of death was multiple blunt force trauma and thermal injuries sustained in the explosion. Investigators found the main gas valve had been reopened and the warning tag removed. The technician's service report confirmed Rita had restored gas flow against explicit safety instructions.
It was April 2016 in Maricopa County, Arizona. The urgent care clinic was mid-afternoon quiet, the kind of lull where the waiting room is half empty and the staff have finally started catching up on paperwork. Outside, it was already 89 degrees Fahrenheit, early even for Phoenix in April, the kind of dry heat that makes air conditioning feel like a reward the moment you walk through the door. I mention the heat because it becomes relevant later, not as atmosphere, Joanne Marie Pruitt was 51, a retired school administrator, methodical, organized, and someone who by every account treated most interactions as processes she intended to control. She had spent a career managing people, schedules, and outcomes, and she brought that same disposition into rooms where it didn't serve her. There's a specific kind of confidence that comes from decades of being the person who runs things, and I think it explains a lot about what happened next. She had documented early-stage hypertension, diagnosed 18 months prior. Her physician had prescribed a calcium channel blocker. She filled it twice and stopped. Her stated position, repeated across at least 2 different doctors at 2 different practices, was that medication was for people who couldn't manage things naturally. She was managing it naturally. She had the track record to point to, 18 months of nothing catastrophic happening. And I think that's exactly what made the position so difficult to shift. 18 months of being fine is almost airtight. Until it isn't. That afternoon, she walked into the clinic complaining of a severe headache and pressure behind her eyes. The intake nurse recorded her blood pressure at 198/114. That number is not a headache, and I want to be precise about that because I think people hear high blood pressure and picture something manageable. In a patient with a documented hypertension history, a reading that high is a hypertensive crisis, and the clinical response is immediate intervention, not a discussion about whether the patient agrees with the framing. The attending physician told her plainly what the reading meant. He offered an oral antihypertensive medication to bring the pressure down in a controlled setting. Joanne refused. He recommended IV administration as a faster alternative. She refused that too. The exchange was documented in full. She told him she didn't take pharmaceutical interventions, that she managed it better than medication ever could, and that she had come in for the headache, not a lecture on her lifestyle. I've read that line in the notes more than once. The physician's notes record that he explained the risk of stroke and hypertensive emergency in direct terms. Joanne dismissed it and told him to treat the headache or discharge her. Something worth understanding about what was happening physiologically in that room. At a sustained reading above 180/120, the pressure on the arterial walls serving the brain is operating outside the range they're built to reliably contain. The risk at that point isn't a possibility to be weighed. It's a question of timing and trigger. Sustained emotional agitation pushes that reading higher in real time. The argument she was having with the physician was not a neutral event inside her body. I don't think it would have changed anything if she had known that, and that's the part I find hardest to reason through. She signed the against medical advice form and walked out. The witness statements note that staff watched her cross the parking lot. That detail stayed with me. They watched her go because they already knew what they had just written down. Joanne collapsed in the parking lot shortly after leaving the clinic. A bystander called emergency services immediately, and paramedics reached her within 4 minutes. By the time she arrived at the hospital, the hemorrhagic stroke had already progressed to a point where intervention was unlikely to change the outcome. She was admitted to intensive care and died the following morning without regaining consciousness. Confirmed cause of death was hemorrhagic stroke secondary to hypertensive crisis. The urgent care record was recovered in full. The refusal documentation, the AMA form, the physician's notes from the exchange. Prior prescription records confirmed the medication had not been filled in over a year. Her primary care physician provided a statement consistent with the documented history. Case closed.
Now this next story opens up completely onto a highway, where distance between vehicles becomes the main factor shaping everything that follows. It was March 22nd, 2017, and a stretch of interstate highway was experiencing steady morning traffic under a flat, gray sky. The road surface was dry and visibility was clear. Conditions were normal, with no environmental factors contributing to risk beyond routine highway flow. Tammy Grulich, 47, worked in medical billing and commuted twice weekly to a medical office in Zanesville. She had no criminal or significant medical history. She consistently wore a seatbelt and had no known mechanical issues with her vehicle. In the year prior, she had expressed frequent frustration with other drivers and often characterized herself as more competent. than those around her, particularly in congested or high-speed traffic conditions. Derek Osei, 34, drove a box truck transporting medical supplies along regional routes. He had 6 years of professional driving experience without at-fault incidents. Approximately 3 miles behind him, Greg and Susan Farwell were traveling with their 2 grandchildren in a minivan after a family visit. They maintained standard highway spacing and steady speed consistent with normal traffic flow. As vehicles merged from an on-ramp, Derek entered the right lane at highway speed with proper signaling. Tammy, approaching from behind at a higher speed, rapidly closed the distance and began aggressive interaction, including flashing her headlights. She then moved into the left lane, drew alongside the truck, and blocked its ability to change lanes before cutting sharply in front of it. Derek reduced speed to maintain safe spacing and did not engage. If it were me, I would have backed off right there instead of trying to hold position that close to a truck. But over the next several miles, Tammy continued a pattern of escalating aggressive driving behavior. She repeatedly alternated between speeding up and slowing down, creating unstable flow for surrounding vehicles. At multiple points, she forced following drivers to brake unexpectedly, then accelerated again once gaps widened. Her driving pattern required constant adjustment from traffic behind her and reduced overall roadway predictability. The behavior escalated further when she performed a sudden and extreme deceleration from highway speed to a near stop within seconds. This created an immediate hazard for all vehicles behind her. Derek changed lanes to avoid contact. The minivan following behind her was already required to adjust speed repeatedly due to her prior actions, and now had insufficient distance to fully stop. The minivan struck the rear of her vehicle at high speed. The impact propelled her car forward into the lane ahead, where it continued until it passed beneath the rear structure of the box truck in front of it. The underride guard engaged the upper portion of the cabin. The structural intrusion caused collapse of the roof and upper frame of the vehicle. Tammy, restrained by her seatbelt, sustained severe trauma during both impacts. The initial rear collision caused serious spinal and thoracic injuries due to seatbelt loading forces. The subsequent underride impact caused catastrophic injury to the head and chest region, resulting in immediate loss of vital function. She would not have remained conscious after the second impact. The vehicle came to rest on the shoulder of the highway. The truck driver brought his vehicle to a controlled stop and immediately contacted emergency services. Responders arrived shortly afterward. Occupants of the minivan sustained non-life-threatening injuries and were treated at the scene. The children in the vehicle were unharmed. The cause of death was multiple blunt force traumatic injuries from a two-phase collision sequence. The first impact caused severe but potentially survivable injuries. The second impact, involving underride intrusion into the passenger compartment, caused fatal trauma to the head, chest, and major blood vessels, resulting in rapid circulatory failure. The initiating factor in the sequence was determined to be sudden and extreme deceleration, combined with repeated aggressive driving behavior that destabilized surrounding traffic. The incident was reviewed for contributing factors related to vehicle spacing, braking behavior, and collision dynamics. The findings contributed to ongoing discussions in commercial vehicle safety regarding risk created by abrupt deceleration in high-speed traffic environments. It was June 7, 2014. A small art studio in Portland, Oregon, was running one of its weekend glass-blowing demonstrations. The kind of thing where a dozen or so people pay to watch a professional work, standing around a central furnace area while the artist walks them through the process. The studio was warm, naturally, and smelled like hot metal and wood ash. Not a big space, but a well-run one. Gemma Ruick was 38 years old, and from the moment she walked in, she was already a problem. She'd come in with a friend who had bought them both tickets as a birthday gift. Her idea of a fun Saturday, apparently. She complained about the parking on the way in, complained about the temperature inside the studio, and threw a fit at the front about not being allowed to bring her coffee cup in. By the time the demonstration started, she was already visibly irritated. About 20 minutes in, Gemma started making herself known. She kept interrupting with loud comments, not questions, just declarations, that the shape wasn't coming out right, that the artist was moving too slowly. At one point, she told the group she'd seen this done better at a mall kiosk. I'd have been mortified if I were her friend. The artist kept his composure and kept working. The rest of the group had gone quiet in that uncomfortable way people do when one person is ruining it for everyone. Then Gemma started pushing closer to the work area, edging past the floor markers that designated the spectator boundary. The artist noticed and calmly told her to step back behind the line. She told him she couldn't see properly from back there. He told her the boundary was a safety requirement, not a suggestion. She told him she'd paid good money for this and wasn't going to stand in the back like she was in a school assembly. He repeated himself. She crossed her arms and stayed exactly where she was. A few minutes later, the artist needed to make a quick adjustment to the propane valve on the side of the furnace. Routine. Something that takes both hands and about 20 to 30 seconds of focused attention. He set the blowpipe down on the rest cradle, a metal support that holds the pipe horizontally, with the gather end extended safely away from the work area, and stepped to the side of the furnace. That was the window. Gemma stepped forward, reached out, and grabbed the blowpipe off the cradle with her bare right hand. Not at the gather end, but roughly midway up the pipe where heat conduction from the molten glass had made the metal dangerously hot. The burn to her palm and fingers was immediate and severe. Her reflex was to pull her hand back, which jerked the pipe toward her and swung the gather end, still carrying a fist-sized glob of glass at close to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, directly toward her face. The molten glass made contact with her left cheek and the left corner of her mouth. At that temperature, glass adheres instantly to skin. It doesn't splash or drip, it bonds. She recoiled sharply, which partially separated the material, but dragged it across the tissue around her lips and the front of her throat just below the chin. The tearing made it worse, not better. The artist turned around within seconds. Removing the adhered glass was not an option. It would have caused further tearing and deeper tissue damage. Other attendees called for emergency services immediately. Responders arrived within about 6 minutes. By that point, the tissue around her mouth and throat had begun to swell rapidly from the thermal injury, and that swelling was the real problem. It was compressing her airway from the outside. She lost consciousness en route to a nearby medical facility. Attempts to establish a surgical airway were severely complicated by the extent of the burns, and the partially hardened glass still adhered to the tissue around her throat. She was pronounced dead approximately 40 minutes after the initial injury. The cause of death was thermal burns to the face and throat, with progressive airway compromise resulting from a combination of external swelling, compressing the airway, direct thermal damage to the upper airway mucosa, and inhalation injury to the airway below the glottis. Secondary contributing factors included full-thickness contact burns to the right hand and cardiovascular stress consistent with severe acute burn trauma. The blowpipe was collected as evidence. Witness statements from every attendee confirmed Gemma had crossed the safety boundary, ignored 2 direct instructions to step back, and grabbed the pipe without any contact or prompting from the artist. He was cleared of any wrongdoing. The studio's safety protocols, boundary markers, rest cradle placement, pipe positioning were reviewed and found to be fully appropriate. The case was ruled an accidental death and closed within 2 months.
It was January 19, 2014, in Atlanta, Georgia. Gray clouds hung low over the city as temperatures dropped. A 14-story office building in the downtown business district housed multiple companies and saw heavy weekday traffic. Lorraine Vickers was 46 years old and worked on the 12th floor as an office manager. She had been with the company for 8 years and was familiar with the building's layout. She was known for frequently complaining to building management about various inconveniences, including the temperature controls, parking assignments, and what she considered unnecessary fire drills. She had previously sent multiple emails demanding the company provide special accommodations for her during evacuations due to her knee problems, insisting she shouldn't be expected to use stairs like everyone else. She often reminded coworkers that she had seniority and certain standards she expected the building to meet. On this day, she was preparing to leave when the fire alarm sounded. Lorraine's coworkers immediately moved toward the stairwell, but she stopped and rolled her eyes. As others filed past, she loudly commented that the alarm was probably another drill and that she refused to walk down 12 flights of stairs for nothing. A coworker urged her to come along, but Lorraine waved her off dismissively and walked toward the elevator bank instead. Lorraine pressed the elevator call button repeatedly. Another coworker passing by told her the elevators were disabled and urged her to use the stairs. Lorraine snapped that she knew what she was doing and continued pressing the button. After approximately 2 minutes, one elevator began ascending. A sensor malfunction in the recall system had prevented this particular unit from fully shutting down. The elevator stopped at the 12th floor and the doors opened. Lorraine stepped inside with her belongings and pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed and the elevator began descending. Smoke from the 9th floor fire spread through the corridor and began seeping into the elevator shaft through gaps around the doors and ventilation openings. The elevator descended past the 11th floor normally. Between the 10th and 9th floors, smoke density increased significantly in the shaft. As conditions in the shaft worsened, the elevator's safety system triggered an emergency stop, leaving the car halted between floors near the 9th level where the fire was burning. The doors did not open. Lorraine was trapped inside. Smoke began entering the cabin through door seams and the ceiling ventilation panel at an increasing rate. The emergency call button connected her to building security. Her voice was recorded asking for help and stating she could not breathe. The call lasted approximately 90 seconds before she stopped responding. Fire crews arrived within 5 minutes of the alarm. They accessed the elevator shaft from the 9th floor and forced open the doors within 14 minutes of Lorraine entering. She was found unconscious on the floor, surrounded by dense smoke. Lorraine was removed and brought to ground level. Paramedics administered oxygen and attempted resuscitation, but she did not regain consciousness. She was transported to a medical facility and pronounced dead approximately 40 minutes after arrival. The cause of death was smoke inhalation leading to asphyxiation, with critically elevated carbon monoxide levels in her bloodstream. The 9th floor fire had been contained quickly, but smoke had spread rapidly through the elevator shaft. Investigators determined Lorraine had entered an elevator that should have been locked out due to a sensor malfunction. Her decision to use the elevator during an active fire alarm was cited as the primary contributing factor. The building management replaced the entire elevator recall system and installed additional visual warning systems at elevator banks during fire alarms.
The next situation I found shifts into a grocery store where the setting feels ordinary right up until it doesn't. It was November 3rd, 2020, and a grocery store in Naperville, Illinois, was operating through a routine morning rush. Checkout lines, fluorescent lighting, and the steady noise of refrigeration units. Nothing about the scene suggested anything out of the ordinary. Rhonda Peltier, 61, was a retired direct sales representative active in online medical skepticism and personal rights groups. She had no significant medical history. She was physically healthy, wore reading glasses on a lanyard around her neck, and carried a large, structured tote bag she used as a purse. The kind with a rigid flat bottom and exterior zip pockets she frequently rifled through during arguments to produce her phone. At the store entrance, a sign required face coverings. Rhonda entered without one, stating she was exempt after a brief exchange with staff. She then proceeded inside and later joined a checkout line behind Carol Sims, a cancer patient wearing a mask and moving slowly with her groceries. Rhonda commented on Carol's mask, despite no interaction being initiated by Carol. When Carol did not respond, Rhonda reached forward and pulled the mask from Carol's face by the ear loop. Carol took it back and quietly stated she was undergoing chemotherapy and asked to be left alone. Rhonda dismissed the statement and continued speaking loudly about masks, rights, and restrictions. Several customers in nearby lines began recording the interaction. It didn't even feel like anything serious at first, just people slowly starting to watch. A store employee approached and asked Rhonda to step back from the customer. She refused and continued raising her voice. The situation drew attention from staff, and a manager attempted to de-escalate the conflict. Rhonda remained focused on arguing her position, speaking over instructions and gesturing repeatedly. Her behavior became increasingly agitated and physically animated, drawing further attention from surrounding customers. As the confrontation continued, Rhonda reached into her tote bag and pulled out her phone to record what she called harassment by store staff. In doing so, she also dislodged a travel-size hand lotion bottle, cylindrical, uncapped at the bottom, which fell from the bag and landed on the tile floor behind her right foot without her noticing. A moment later, Rhonda took one step backward, a standard shift in posture during the argument, and her right heel landed directly on the lotion bottle. The bottle rolled outward. Her foot went with it. She had no time to correct. Her body weight was already shifting backward, and her arms were occupied, phone in one hand, tote strap in the other. She went down fast, straight back, with nothing to catch herself on. The back of her head struck the tile floor with a single, flat impact. Several witnesses described the sound. She did not attempt to get up. She was unconscious immediately after impact and did not respond to her name. A customer kneeling beside her noted that her right pupil appeared larger than her left within approximately 2 minutes of the fall. Staff called emergency services and began assisting her. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was started while waiting for medical response. Bystanders continued recording the scene as staff attempted basic life support measures. She was treated on scene due to unresponsiveness and transported to a hospital. A CT scan confirmed a large acute epidural hematoma, a blood clot pressing on the brain from the point of impact at the base of the skull. Emergency neurosurgery was performed, but the herniation had already caused irreversible brainstem damage. She did not regain consciousness. Life support was withdrawn 4 days later. The cause of death was acute epidural hematoma secondary to blunt force head trauma. Manner of death accidental. The back of her skull struck the tile floor with sufficient force to fracture the occipital bone and lacerate a blood vessel beneath it, causing rapid bleeding between the skull and brain that compressed critical structures within minutes. Her phone, still recording, was recovered face up on the floor, with footage ending at the moment she stepped back. It was March 3rd, 2015, a mid-rise apartment complex in suburban Ohio. Just a regular Tuesday evening. People coming home from work, TVs on, dinner being made. The kind of building where you know your neighbors just enough to nod at them in the hallway. Nothing about that night looked unusual from the outside. If you asked anyone in that building about Creetha Solm, 51, you'd get the same answer. She had a complaint about everything. The parking lot, the hallway lighting, the way other tenants let their doors close too hard. 6 years in that building, and she'd managed to have a problem with just about everyone in it at some point. That evening, she'd come home already wound up after getting into it with a group of neighborhood kids she was convinced had been messing with her car in the parking lot. She'd screamed at them, threatened to call their parents, and stormed upstairs feeling like she'd won something. That mood is important. What she had no idea about was that a gas line servicing her floor had developed a slow leak earlier that day. Maintenance had been notified, and a written notice had been slipped under her door that afternoon. Stay out of your unit until the line gets inspected. One piece of paper standing between her and what was about to happen. She never read it. Coming off that confrontation downstairs, still fuming, she spotted the folded notice on the floor just inside her doorway and immediately assumed the kids had shoved it under her door as payback. She picked it up, crumpled it without opening it, and tossed it toward the trash can. Didn't even hesitate. Natural gas is treated to have a strong, rotten egg smell, so leaks are easy to catch. But Creetha regularly burned scented candles in her apartment and had left some going earlier that day. The lingering scent likely masked the gas. By the time she walked in, it had already been building inside the unit for hours. She dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes, and decided she was going to run herself a bath. She'd had a long day, she'd dealt with those kids, and as far as she was concerned, she deserved to unwind. She went to the bathroom, turned on the tap, and reached for her aromatherapy candles on the shelf, the ones she lit specifically to decompress. She struck a match. The gas concentration in the unit had been sitting well within the explosive range for hours at that point. One flame was all it took. The explosion tore through the bathroom and the adjoining wall, blew out the exterior window, and partially collapsed the floor between her unit and the one below. 2 floors down, people felt it. Neighbors called for emergency services within minutes. Responders arrived about 8 minutes later. The fire that followed was contained relatively quickly, but her unit was almost completely destroyed. She was found in the bathroom, directly at the ignition point. The injuries were what you'd expect from that kind of proximity to a gas explosion. Severe blast trauma to the torso and head, full-thickness burns across her upper body, and blunt force injuries from the structural collapse around her. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as combined blast trauma and thermal burns with contributing injuries from structural debris. The gas leak was confirmed to have originated from a corroded fitting on the supply line servicing her floor, a legitimate maintenance issue that had been caught and flagged that same day. The crumpled notice was recovered from her trash can, still unread, and logged as evidence. The match used for ignition was recovered near the blast origin point. The case was ruled an accidental death. Maintenance records confirmed the notice had been delivered to her unit that afternoon. No negligence was found on the part of building management. The The neighboring unit sustained significant structural damage, but its occupant wasn't home at the time, closed within 2 months.
It was October 8, 2017, in Sedona, Arizona. Desert heat beat down on the Red Rock landscape. A popular canyon trail was experiencing high foot traffic due to the holiday weekend. Lauren Whitmore, 44, was a corporate trainer from Chicago visiting Sedona with her husband for their anniversary. She had hiked portions of trails in Colorado on previous vacations and made a point of correcting other hikers she encountered about proper trail etiquette and gear choices. That morning, she had told other hikers at the trailhead that this route was overrated and too crowded for what it offered. She had little patience for casual hikers who treated trails like amusement parks rather than serious outdoor activities. Lauren had been complaining about the crowd since they started, making comments about people moving too slowly and blocking the trail for photos. She had tried to push past several groups on narrow sections and made remarks about tourists ruining everything. Her husband tried to calm her down multiple times, but she dismissed him. At a crowded section where the trail narrowed near a scenic viewpoint, Lauren stopped in frustration. Her husband suggested they wait a few minutes for the group ahead to clear. Lauren refused, stating she had not driven all this way to stand in line. She pointed to what appeared to be a parallel path approximately 20 feet to the right, a dried creek bed with flat sand that seemed to bypass the congestion. Her husband said it looked unsafe and they should stay on the marked trail. Lauren dismissed him, saying the trail designers had not accounted for this many people. Lauren stepped off the main trail onto the unmarked route without waiting. The dried creek bed appeared solid, with a light-colored sandy surface that looked firm. She walked approximately 60 feet along it, moving faster than the main trail crowd. Her husband called out repeatedly, but she waved him off without turning around. Her right foot suddenly sank several inches into the sand. She stopped and tried to pull it out, but her left foot also began sinking. The surface sand was dry and appeared solid, but beneath it was saturated sand and silt from recent rainfall. Lauren's weight had broken through the thin crust. She tried to lift her right leg, but the suction pulled her deeper. She leaned forward to brace with her hands, but this shifted more weight onto her lower body. Within 90 seconds, she was trapped to her knees and leaning forward at an awkward angle as the saturated sand tightened around her legs. Her husband reached the creek bed edge and attempted to pull her out by her arms, but each attempt caused the surrounding sand to collapse tighter around her legs. Other hikers called emergency services and searched for branches for leverage. Lauren was breathing heavily in the extreme heat, visibly exhausted. She was trapped to her upper thighs, bent forward in a position that compressed her diaphragm. Approximately 6 minutes after getting stuck, Lauren stopped responding. Her head drooped forward, and she lost consciousness, collapsing further into the sand. Hikers attempted to lift her upper body, but the suction made it nearly impossible. Specialized rescue personnel reached the creek bed nearly 40 minutes after the first emergency call. By then, the surrounding sand had hardened around Lauren's legs, requiring controlled digging and water to loosen the packed silt before she could be freed. When rescuers finally pulled her from the ground, she showed no signs of consciousness. Investigators later concluded that prolonged entrapment in extreme heat, combined with the forward compressed position of her body, led to a rapid medical collapse before rescue teams could stabilize her. Her death was attributed to heat-related stress and positional asphyxia after leaving the marked trail and entering unstable terrain.
It was February 9th, 2016, in Houston, Texas. The apartment on Westheimer Road was tidy and well lit. A ring light set up in the living room and a camera on a tripod aimed at the small table where Nia did most of her filming. Nia Kelly, 27, ran a beauty channel with around 4,000 subscribers. Her content was built around a single idea. Expensive cosmetic procedures had cheaper alternatives, and she was going to find them. She called the series Why Pay More? She tested everything herself before recommending it, which was the reason her viewers trusted her. She had tried budget chemical peels, at-home microneedling rollers, and DIY lash lifts. She had filmed all of it and posted all of it, and nothing had gone seriously wrong. But I must say something here. A chemical peel and a needle going into your face are not the same category of risk. For the newest episode, she had ordered a DIY lip filler kit from an overseas website. The package arrived in a plain padded envelope. Inside was a pre-filled syringe containing a clear gel labeled only as dermal filler gel, with no ingredient list, no manufacturer name, and no dosage guidance. A small tube of numbing cream was included alongside an instruction sheet translated so poorly it was barely readable. And I need you to picture that instruction sheet for a second. No ingredients, no manufacturer, barely readable instructions. And then she just glanced at it and set it aside. The tutorials she had watched made the process look straightforward, and she trusted those more than a badly translated sheet of paper. She had watched 4 YouTube videos of other creators injecting their own lips, and all of them had been fine. Clinics charged hundreds of dollars for something that looked this simple. That was the entire premise of the video. And honestly, clinics do overcharge for a lot of things, but a needle going into my face is an experiment I won't want to try. Her younger sister set up the camera and pressed record. Nia opened the episode the same way she always did. She held up the kit and told her viewers that what they were about to watch cost her less than a makeup palette, while clinics charged several $100s for the exact same result. She said the tutorials made it look easy because it was easy. She was selling it to her audience before she had even picked up the needle. That's scary to me. She applied the numbing cream and waited for it to take effect, talking to the camera the whole time. Then she picked up the syringe. She aimed for the upper lip border, following the angle she had seen in the tutorials. What the tutorials had not explained, and what Nia had no way of knowing, was that the upper lip sits in a region of the face with critical arterial connections running close beneath the surface. And this is the part that genuinely unsettles me. She was following instructions from people who she wasn't sure of. Unfortunately for her, the needle entered a vessel, and filler was pushed into it under pressure. The gel moved through the vascular system in the direction of least resistance. The skin around the injection site turned pale and mottled almost immediately. Nia noticed it and frowned at the camera, saying the area looked a little white, but that it would probably settle. Over the next minute or two, the discoloration spread, and she said there was pressure building behind her eye. Her sister, behind the camera, laughed, assuming she was playing up the reaction for the video. And I understand why she laughed. Nia had always been fine before, but everything became serious when Nia said the vision on one side had gone dark. Her speech slowed and became imprecise. She put her hand to her face and went still in the chair. Her sister called 911 within minutes. Paramedics arrived and found Nia conscious but severely disoriented, with sudden vision loss in one eye and slurred speech. She was transported to hospital immediately. Imaging showed findings consistent with vascular occlusion following filler injection, with evidence of embolic stroke affecting part of the brain. The damage was severe and irreversible. Nia never regained full consciousness after the first night. She died 2 days later. She was 27 years old. That's the part I found more tragic. And guess what? The video was never uploaded. All for nothing.